I'm thinking about a phone, and when I don't know how to use a phone very well. My young kids tell me this, and usually I'm looking for that, and they tell me I could find it with this, and I just didn't know the phone did that. I didn't know it had that capability. Who knows what a phone can do, and I don't even know what it's there. I keep looking for that, not realizing that that could be found through this, and sometimes spiritually speaking, that can happen. And uh, there's this guy named Philip. He was an early follower of Jesus, and he was looking for that, and that was God. And he had been assuming, like everyone else, that Jesus was a moral teacher. He was a guide. He was a spiritual helper. And Jesus was helping people find God. And God was somewhere else over there, and Jesus was here. So Philip, he's loving, he's digging it. He's really into what Jesus has been teaching him. The desires of his heart feel touched and emotionally satisfied. He's overflowing. He says, "Hey, Jesus, let's just get on with it. Show us the Father. Show us God." And he's thinking, like everyone else around at that time, and like most of us, that God is somewhere else and Jesus is here. Hey, show us that. But Philip doesn't realize, according to Jesus, that that is found with this. And Jesus says something bewildering, startling. We're going to see a little bit later how offensive what he says is, but he says, have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? And now notice what he says. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? That's just, as some young people would say, that's just stupid. That's weird. Jesus isn't saying, right, God's out there and I'm here, Philip. What Jesus is doing is reorienting Philip's assumptions. And he's saying, Philip, if you want to see God, look at me. If you want to see God, look at me, Jesus is saying. Now, Philip's not alone in being confused by that. Everyone else around would have assumed that, and we assume that today. The majority of Americans, especially younger Americans, do not believe that Jesus is anything more than a good moral teacher. The other way to say that is most of your neighbors and most of us listening think of Jesus as a good and moral guru, a spiritual guide, someone who can help us get through our life with his good teachings. And so, Philip's in good company. The thing that's wild is Jesus just sees it differently. This is what Jesus goes on to say. Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? And I think Philip would say, why, no, I don't. This is news to me. This is news to me. And if you just pause on what that claim is, that's pretty out there kind of statement. Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? I am in God and God is in me. The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his work. Okay, in order to be God, you have to be infinite. That's part of the job description. You have to know everything, be everywhere at once, be able to do everything. Jesus is saying, the Father dwells in me. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. Now, I just want to pause here and say there's some comfort. If you're curious about Jesus, if you're trying to figure Jesus out, there's some comfort here. The earliest folks that followed him, you don't just dig a deep well in a minute. It takes a while to deal with mystery and statements like, if you want to see God, just look at me. And so Philip's been traveling with Jesus for a little while, and it'll take him a while to catch on to this. And if you feel like Jesus, on one day you feel like you're starting to get a handle on Jesus, you feel like, wow, he is remarkable. And then the very next day you're going to encounter something he had to say, and you're going to say, what? Time out. I don't know. Maybe I'm out on this Christianity thing because Jesus is just puzzling and bewildering to me. And I just want to say you're in good company. Uh, this seems to be the way with us as we follow Jesus. Now, when you're looking for God, I'd like to ask you, who are you looking to help you find God? Or with your questions about God, who are you looking to? I mean, there's really only a handful of sources. Some of us look to ourselves. Is that what you're doing? You look inside yourself. Others of us look to other people, like Philip was looking to Jesus, and we look for other people. Others of us look to what we think of as nature, like trees and the wind and birds, the sun. Others of us look to art, the arts, music, poetry, to feel a sense of God. And what's happening here is that Jesus is saying he's the one to look to. Now, that can sound, not only bewildering, but kind of bold, daring. But until you think about, on one hand, it's kind of common sense. I mean, all of us worship something. Could you agree with that? That you worship something? Would you agree with that? You worship something. What does it mean to worship something? It means to orbit around it. It's the one thing in your life that you cannot let go of. What would that be? What is the thing or person or place in your life that if you were to lose it, you believe you're over? You wouldn't be able to go on. I think that way of my own wife and children. I think if I were to lose my wife or children, I would feel as though my world was over. And yet, as Jesus would tell me, my world would not actually be over. It would only be over if I worshipped my wife and children. It would not be over if something else other than them were the center of all things. What would it be for you? If we want to ride a bike, you got to have wheels. If you want to drive your car, your wheels have to work. We got to have legs to walk, or a cane, or a walker. We have to have wings on a plane. We need a little red wagon to get from one place to another. The thing is, all of us need something that can carry us along. If we want to get from here to there, we have to have help. What are you looking to as that help? And as we begin to grapple with that, we begin to see what it is we might worship. And Jesus is saying he's the one. I was talking to a woman this week in the community, not a part of our church, not a Christian person, and in tears as she just looked at me and said this: I used to be somebody. I used to be somebody. And now I'm just this decrepit person. And she was remembering the powerful influence she had at a particular job. And now that she's long since retired, she doesn't have that anymore. She's not looked to in that way. And it's difficult for her to imagine continuing. And I get that. In this sense, all of us feel like there's something, and if we lose it, we wouldn't be able to go on. Jesus is saying he is the thing that if we were to lose, we wouldn't be able to go on. So, Philip, you're looking at that to find God, and I'm saying to find that, you need to look at this. This is what Jesus is doing with Philip, reorienting our lives there. Now, the early Christians, you just want to know this, they believed this and began to teach it. Here's just a couple of examples. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he's before all things, and in him all things hold together. The earliest Christians just began to say Jesus is the thing around which everything seen and unseen orbits. He holds it all together. Or another example, Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty of God. Now, here's the thing. The Romans at the time, when they encountered Christians, this is how Romans who did not believe in Jesus, who did not follow Jesus, some of whom persecuted followers of Jesus, this is what they encountered when they experienced Christians, the earliest Christians. Lucian says this: the Christians, you know, worship a man to this day. Now this is a person who is an outsider. He's not a part of the Christian community. He's encountering Christians in various ways, and this is how he describes them. They worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains their contempt of death. Voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. Pliny, who is persecuting Christians, he's in charge and writing to talk about this. He just says this: the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. So he's surprised. He thought Christians were doing something wretched and criminal. He's interrogating them, and this is what he finds out. The whole of their guilt, their error, was they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light. And then they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. Do you see that? Now, he probably doesn't know what Christ means. It means the anointed one, the promised one of God. But this is what he's encountering. The Christians worship Christ as a God, and they bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, neither falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it, after which it is their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Now, why does this matter for us? We're saying that, who is Jesus? Jesus says that if you see him, you've seen God. What do the earliest Christians say about him? They say the same. What do those who encountered those earliest Christians say? They say these people are worshiping this person named Jesus like he's God. And then, what would that mean for us? One of the things that you will regularly hear about the Gospels is that someone will say that the Gospels were written 25 to 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Therefore, they cannot be trusted because, and then they'll go on to say, Jesus never claimed to be God. The earliest Christians didn't think he was God. This is a legend, a myth that grew up over years and years and years and gradually became part of their official teaching. But we've just looked at, just briefly introduced, people at the time who described Christians in this way. Christians themselves who talk about this in this way. Whether you agree or not that Jesus is God, to say that the earliest Christians and Jesus himself didn't believe that is simply an error. It's simply an error. It's a mistake. It's historically inaccurate. But let's just think of common sense for a moment. This idea, well, if a gospel was written 25 years later, then we can't trust it. I'd like to ask you who are old enough this question. Where were you on September 11th, 2001? Tell me about that day. I mean, that's 20 years ago. Do you think I could trust what you have to say? Do you think you'd remember that day? Yeah. Do you know why? Because there's nothing like that day. Very few things come around like that. And when something like that happens, it's emblazoned on our memory. Could we ask 4 years from now when it's 25 years, do we have to say at that point, okay, we can no longer talk to anyone about September 11th. They're not trustworthy. Of course not. What we would say is, I would like to talk to as many people as I can who were actually there. The Holocaust in the 1940s, would we say that if there was a Holocaust survivor today, would you say, I don't want to talk to them, they're untrustworthy? No, you wouldn't. They were there, even all these years later. And you would want to know what they had to say and what they saw. The idea isn't if something is remembered 25 years later, we can't trust it. Shouldn't it rather be, is the memory trustworthy? Because all of us can't do life without having to think back in this way. Last week we looked at how Jesus answered the question, who is God? And most often he answers that question by using a metaphor and looking at in the ordinary world. But now we're puzzled, we're stunned, we're shattered, we're struck, because Jesus seems to now answer the question, who is God? Look at me. That's what Jesus is saying. Jesus said that, the earliest Christians said that, those who encountered the earliest Christians observed that about them. And what difference does that make? It made this difference. Pliny in his letter to Trajan goes on to talk about requiring Christians to bow to Caesar. He says this, in the meantime, the method I have observed toward those who have been denounced to me as Christians is this. I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed. For whatever the nature of their creed might be, I could at least feel no doubt that contumacy and inflexible obstinacy deserved punishment. What's the obstinacy? They will not bow to Caesar. Soon accusations spread, as usually happens because of the proceedings going on. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, Trajan, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose together with statues of the gods. See what he's saying? Trajan, I have a statue of you. I have a statue of the gods. I require Christians to denounce Christus and to worship you. And notice what he says. None of which, that is, cursing Christ, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. Why? Why is a Roman governor here interrogating Christians and threatening persecution to them? What is the thing real Christians, he says, will not do? They will not bow to a statue of a politician. And they will not bow to statues of the gods. If they believed that Jesus was just a moral teacher, they would be no threat to Rome. And they could have lived their lives. The fact is, it must have been that Christians believed more. And the issue was, they are harassed and some persecuted because Rome looked at the world through a political lens. And as long as you kept Rome and the Roman political leaders center and worshipped, you'd be fine. But the followers of Jesus would not bow. Why? Because everybody worships something. All of us orbit around something. Some of us orbit around politics and politicians and we bow to their statues. Others of us orbit ourselves around sexuality or people or work or places or our influence, whatever it is. But the Christians understood what it took time for them to grasp. That if you want to get that, you have to look at this. If you want God, look to Jesus, because Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And as Jesus said, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. And because of that teaching that Jesus is God, they would not bow to anything else. They would only worship Jesus. Isn't that amazing? And so if you're grappling with what it means to follow Jesus, you're entering this bewildering moment where Jesus is inviting you to transition, as he did with Philip, to move from seeing him as a good moral teacher, which he certainly is, but to see that he's more than that. To see that he is actually God himself with us, and that we are to worship him. Well, that's a mystery. That is a mystery. Profound mystery. And what does that mean for us? As Nick and Michelle come back up, we want to reflect on what's being said here. And then when we come back, we want to ask, what difference does this make in our lives?